Thumbs up, we're ready to go. Good morning. Today's hearing of the Congressional-Executive Commission on China on Techno-Authoritarianism, Platform for Repression in China and Abroad, will come to order. This hearing will explore China's role in embracing technology-enhanced authoritarianism and promoting its spread around the world. In China and around the globe, we are seeing the same technology that drives the global economy, facilitates communication, enables financial flows, and provides the conveniences of modern life can also be used for repression. Without proper guardrails to protect privacy and basic human rights, technology can control populations, trample freedom of expression, and undermine institutions of democratic governance. For the Chinese government and Chinese Communist Party, it starts at home. Over many years, the Commission has documented the development of what has become the most pervasive surveillance state the world has ever seen. Authorities embrace technologies such as artificial intelligence, blockchain, and cloud computing, the building blocks of the modern economy, to impose political and social control of targeted populations. These technologies offer the government an unprecedented degree of control, enabled by the collection of massive amounts of data from cell phones, from personal computers, DNA, security cameras, and more. Nowhere do we see this more tragically than in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Today, we will hear testimony outlining the extent of the surveillance in Xinjiang, as well as the heart-wrenching toll on individuals and their communities. We will also hear from expert witnesses who will shed light on the use of technology in mainland China and abroad, both for legitimate purposes of government efficiency and digital connectivity, but also to spread the web of repressive control to cities across China, regions across China, the developing world, and even the Chinese diaspora community in the United States. This adds up to a complex picture. The technologies we will hear about have dual-use potential to be used for good or for ill. Many countries to which China exports surveillance systems and elements of the so-called safe cities model embrace these technologies out of a desire to combat crime or reduce traffic or provide municipal services. Yet these technologies, this high-tech authoritarianism, can be used to strip rights and dignity from millions of people across the planet. Acting to defend freedom and defend democracy will require the establishment of norms for the proper use and boundaries of this technology. But we can't stop there. We have to work with defenders of freedom across the globe to develop attractive and affordable alternatives. This won't be easy. That's why Co-Chairman McGovern and I have convened this hearing. We need to hear from experts on how Congress, the United States government, the international community can address these difficult challenges. Just as the United States confronts limitations in its ability to shape the behavior of the Chinese government, so too will we face limitations in shaping the rest of the world, especially when it comes to technology that empowers everyday life. That's why we need smart action in concert with a coalition of partners. I look forward to the testimony today to help us work to identify the approaches that can harness technology in a way that respects rather than endangering fundamental human rights. I'd now like to recognize my co-chairman, Congressman McGovern, for his opening remarks, and that will be followed by Congressman Smith, who is joining us electronically.
Well, thank you, Chairman Merkley. Thank you for convening this hearing on the Chinese government's use of technology and digital platforms to expand and export its repressive policies. You know, where there was once optimism that the Internet and new technologies would create a more open, democratized global commons, there is now a cloud of darkness. Anti-democratic and authoritarian governments have learned to harness such technology as a means to assert social control. This is no longer just about human rights abuses suffered by people over there. It is about the risks we now face from the phones in our pockets. Take TikTok. It is immensely popular in the United States and can be a lot of fun, or so my kids tell me. It was developed by a Chinese company, and there is nothing inherently wrong with that. But we hear reports that videos on topics sensitive to its government are blocked or disappear. Americans deserve to know whether China's censorship regime is intruding on their daily lives. This concern is why the Commission, under my chairmanship in the last Congress, expanded its reporting to include human rights violations in the United States and globally. Our soon-to-be-released annual report will document how the Chinese government silences criticism, chills the expression of political views, and undermines international norms. The Commission's next hearing will look at the economic coercion aspect of this trend. We cannot forget that the Chinese government's techno-authoritarianism is felt most gravely by the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. The surveillance regime that they have set up in Xinjiang is the most advanced and enveloping in the world. Is this the model for the rest of China and the world? This is the key question that we hope today's witnesses will address. How can the United States ensure that its exports do not abet the spread of the surveillance state? Can we harness international partners? And how do individuals make sound consumer choices? We are addressing an immensely complicated and technical set of issues, and I'm pleased that our witnesses bring a breadth of expertise to these evolving challenges. I hope you will continue to share your research with us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to hearing the testimony of our witnesses.
Congressman Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this very, very important hearing. As we all know, the Silk Road was a network of trade routes connecting the East and West from roughly 2 centuries before Christ to the 18th century, a transformational route in the development of the civilization of not only of China, but also the rest of the world. Likewise, the Great Wall of China was built not only for defense of Chinese borders, but for the regulation, as well as encouragement of trade. In short, these twin legacies of Chinese civilization have contributed much to the greater development of the world through open and transparent exchanges of goods and ideas. Unfortunately, the China under Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party has not continued this proud tradition. Instead of the Great Wall that once protected its citizens while ensuring robust exchanges with the world, the Great Firewall now prevents China's citizens from global engagement through one of the most extensive internet censorship systems the world has ever seen. Similarly, China's Digital Silk Road, or DSR, is not a modern version of the Silk Road, but an intrusive ecosystem of internet architecture and surveillance technology, aiming to expand the People's Republic of China's influence around the world. Sadly, the surveillance facilitated by such tools is a fact of life for Chinese citizens and increasingly for those who live in countries that have adopted Chinese technology. Chinese authorities' relentless persecution of predominantly Muslim Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and others in Central Asian people in the country's Xinjiang region provides a disturbing preview of what these tools misuse on even a broader scale. Residents are tracked through surveillance drones, ubiquitous street cameras, and obligatory spyware apps on their phones. As we all know, many of those who practice a religious faith, including Christians in their churches, are now subjected to ever-increasing amounts of surveillance. Even China's COVID-19 tracking systems and apps that are supposed to protect its citizens are instead used to categorize them via different color codes, according to their health status and other personal data, which are then shared with the police. This is not dystopian fiction, 1984. This is China today. Shockingly, U.S. companies have been complicit in helping China build its techno-totalitarian state. In 2006, as you may know, Mr. Chairman, I chaired a hearing where the representatives of Google, Cisco, Yahoo, and Microsoft testified as to their role in assisting the repression in China. This year, the year before, Yahoo had shared information with China's secret police, which led to the arrest and a 10-year jail sentence of cyber dissident Xu Tao. Yahoo also handed over data regarding one of its users, Li Ji, who had criticized corrupt local Chinese Communist Party officials in online discussion, for which he was sentenced to 8 years in prison. We have now also seen companies like Thermo Fisher Scientific provide equipment to security services in China for a reputed genetic surveillance program. Notwithstanding the company's 2019 announcement to stop selling its equipment in Xinjiang in 2019, amid concerns raised by scientists and human rights groups and our commission that the authorities could use the tools to build systems to track people, the New York Times recently reported that Thermo Fisher equipment continues to be sold to police in Xinjiang. American companies such as Thermo Fisher Scientific, not to mention those companies who subsidize China's Genocide Olympics, that was the subject of a few hearings that we have held on this commission and in the Lantos Human Rights Commission, often tout their commitments to corporate social responsibility principles. Instead, such virtue signaling is now commonplace and is a form of marketing. Corporate social responsibility, however, starts with U.S. global businesses recognizing that their sales of technology products to China for use by China and its allies furthers the interests of the government of China and often against its own people. Instead of virtue signaling, they should take a stand against Chinese human rights abuses. If we fail to affirm our foundational American principles, including our commitment to freedom of expression and speech, I fear that the digital authoritarianism of China will become the new reality increasingly for all of us. Thank you again, Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Smith. I'd now like to introduce our panel. Jeffrey Kane is an award-winning foreign correspondent, author, technologist, and scholar of East and Central Asia. He is the author, most recently, of The Perfect Police State, an undercover odyssey into China's terrifying surveillance dystopia of the future. He has written for The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, Foreign Policy, The New Republic, and The Nation. Samantha Hoffman is a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Her work explores the domestic and global implication of the Chinese Communist Party's approach to state security, offering new ways of thinking about how to respond to China's pursuit of artificial intelligence and big data-enabled capabilities to augment political and social control. Yaqiu Wang is a senior researcher on China at Human Rights Watch, working on issues including internet censorship, freedom of expression, protection of civil society, and human rights defenders and women's rights. Her articles have appeared in Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and elsewhere. She has provided commentary to BBC, CNN, New York Times, and others. Jonathan Hillman is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the director of the Reconnecting Asia Project, one of the most extensive open-source databases tracking China's Belt and Road Initiative. He is the author of The Digital Silk Road, China's Quest to Wire the World and Win the Future. Prior to joining CSIS, he served as a policy advisor in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Now introduce ask the witnesses to deliver their testimony for 5 minutes each in the following order: Mr. Kane, Dr. Hoffman, Ms. Wang, and then Mr. Hillman. Mr. Kane, the floor is yours. And welcome.
Chairman Merkley, Co-Chairman McGovern, and members of the committee, thank you, and it is an honor to be invited to testify here today on China's surveillance apparatus and the threat that it poses globally. Democracies around the world are straddled with a grave and unprecedented problem: the creation of new totalitarian surveillance technologies developed faster than any of us can implement the democratic laws, norms, and checks and balances that will ensure these technologies do not fall into the wrong hands. Today, I will talk about a place where these technologies have enabled genocide and crimes against humanity. I will talk about the situation of the Uyghur population in China's western region of Xinjiang, where about 1.8 million people have languished in a network of hundreds of extrajudicial concentration camps out of an ethnic minority population of about 11 million people. That's about 1/10 of the minority population. Since 2016, the People's Republic of China has engaged in an unprecedented experiment in social control in this region. It has deployed novel technologies in artificial intelligence, facial recognition, voice recognition, and biometric data collection to oppress its people in new and novel ways. In the 20th century, genocides took place in gas chambers and mass graves. But in the 21st century, modern technology has allowed the People's Republic of China to commit the beginnings of a genocide, wiping out a people in silence through cultural erasure and forced sterilizations. This all comes without the use of mass physical violence and mass killings. This is all documented in my book, The Perfect Police State, an undercover odyssey into China's terrifying surveillance dystopia of the future, published in June 2020 by the Hachette Book Group. From August 2017 to February 2021, I was an investigative journalist in China, Turkey, and Kyrgyzstan, where I interviewed 168 Uyghur and Kazakh and other refugees from different ethnic minorities. These refugees consisted of former concentration camp detainees, their family members, American and European diplomats tracking the atrocities, former Chinese government officials, academics, former Uyghur technology employees at major Chinese corporations, and former Uyghur intelligence operatives from the Ministry of State Security, a powerful body in China. In December 2017, I made my final visit to Kashgar, the Uyghur heartland, and Urumqi, the regional capital of Xinjiang. Within 3 days, I was detained and asked to leave. To protect my data, my sources, and my own safety, I have not returned. Uyghur and Kazakh refugees in interviews all told similar stories about the region's descent into a total surveillance dystopia. Most commonly, they recounted how authorities from the Ministry of Public Security, the Ministry of State Security, and numerous Chinese technology firms such as Huawei, Hikvision, SenseTime, Megvii, and many others have innovated the technologies that are deployed for a dragnet. The police then used these technologies for what interviewees said was a system of mass psychological torture. When refugees and former camp detainees say psychological torture, they mean the feeling of constantly being watched, not by humans, but by crude software algorithms designed to predict future crimes and acts of terrorism with great inaccuracy. The software platform known as the IJOP, the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, gathered data from a myriad of sources, including police human inputs, camera surveillance, and criminal and court histories, according to these former technology workers. For them, it was straight out of the science fiction dystopias that they saw once they had left the region, including Minority Report, the film with Tom Cruise about a pre-crime unit that arrests and brainwashes people, accusing them of future crimes that have never happened. These former technology workers told me about how the system worked from the inside of the Chinese surveillance apparatus. They said that artificial intelligence used to train a crude, simple algorithm and find correlations between data points would then match up a number of unrelated outside factors to determine whether people would commit a crime in the future. The system would then send a bump or a nudge to the smartphones of the local police to investigate and detain an individual for reasons often unclear to the human police using the software. These reasons for detention could be as far-flung as whether they went through the front or back door, whether they began a physical exercise routine suddenly, or whether they had the flu and were simply late for work that day. Without a human to oversee these decisions, refugees said they were terrified at the prospect of doing anything that diverted from their daily schedules and that would flag them as potential criminals. They trained themselves to become like machines or robots, able to answer every question from the police in a pre-programmed way, repressing their own feelings, thoughts, and desires in the process. These psychological tactics have been well documented at the network of concentration camps that now exist in the region of Xinjiang. Refugees who have been there have described their fellow detainees as lacking personality or expression, as if they had had a memory wipe. Their only way of surviving was to do what camp guards and teachers told them without question. The surveillance technology was designed to force them to deny their own reality and to internalize the thinking of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. By internalizing this propaganda, these detainees did exactly what the apparatus wanted of them, and that was to erase their own internal sense of culture, heritage, community, and upbringing, which separated them and their culture from the dominant Han population. With that, there is certainly much that we can do to tackle this problem, and I am aware of time, so I will hand over the floor to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kane. And now we're going to turn to Samantha Hoffman, who is joining us from Australia. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Markley, Co-Chair McGovern, members of the Commission. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today on this important topic. I'd like to begin with a brief explanation of what I think the appropriate definition of tech authoritarianism is, which is that when we're talking about authoritarian technology, we are really talking about the ways that technology is attached to existing methods of political and social control and economic management as well in the PRC. So oftentimes, while we tend to focus on the most coercive applications of technology, we sometimes tend to overlook the more everyday applications of technology and the way that that enhances authoritarian power as well. Now with that, I'd like to go over 3 core assessments and offer some policy recommendations. I'd like to note that throughout my testimony, I offer some charts that help to explain the concepts I'll go over, and I'm happy to answer more in Q&A. So the core assessments. First, assumptions that liberal democracy would automatically be strengthened by and authoritarians would automatically be weakened when the world became digitally interconnected have been proven false. Democracies are not going to self-correct in response to the problems created by authoritarian applications of technology. Competing with China in this space, it's not simply about winning or losing a race in terms of R&D of emerging and critical technologies such as AI or data science and storage technologies. Leadership in R&D in these areas is essential, not least to guarantee supply chain resilience. But just as consequential is the competition taking place in the conceptual space. So for the United States and like-minded countries to stay ahead, they must innovate in thinking about use cases in order to also set boundaries so that these technologies can positively affect society without also undermining liberal democratic values. Second, the ability to identify and protect strategic data will become increasingly complex and vital national security task, especially under the conditions of China's military-civil fusion strategy. Knowing how particular data sets are collected and used by foreign adversaries and imagining potential use cases will be an essential part of ranking which data sets should be prioritized for protection. Developing effective countermeasures requires understanding the implications of the fact that the Chinese party state conceives of the usefulness of data in a strategic competition in ways that go beyond traditional intelligence collection. Finally, we cannot measure risk based on today's capabilities alone. Technology evolves on a trajectory, and to develop effective policy responses requires assuming that the challenges China faces today in realizing the optimal outcomes of the application of technology to its authoritarian governance may not be as significant in the future as the concepts increasingly catch up with capabilities. The areas of policy where I think that we need to focus on, I think that we often tend to offer prescriptive solutions when actually we haven't clearly identified the problem yet. So with that, I'd like to recommend for U.S. policy that time is spent to recalibrate data security policy and privacy frameworks to account for the fact that the Chinese party states' use of data reinforce its political monopoly. Oftentimes, companies and governments assume that their data and privacy regulations share the same goals as our own, which isn't true when it comes to the Chinese party state and PRC companies. Even if common vocabularies are used or some policy drivers are similar, in the PRC, unlike in liberal democracies, data security and privacy concepts, including legislation on data security and the Personal Information Protection Law recently, reinforce the party state's monopoly on power. So companies and governments, the United States included, need to recognize this risk and calibrate their policies to account for it. Second, the United States should collaborate with like-minded countries to develop systems for improving risk-based approaches to improving the regulation of data transfers. Organizations and governments must be able to assess the value of their data and the value of that data to any party in their supply chain who might have access to it downstream. Finally, I'm aware I'm running out of time. Governments must take a multidisciplinary approach to due diligence. Governments, as well as businesses and organizations, need to develop frameworks for conducting supply chain reviews that take into account country-specific policy drivers. Developing such a framework shouldn't be limited to just assessing the vendor's risk of exposure to political risk. It should also include detailed analysis of the downstream actors who have access to a vendor's data. And it must include analysis of things such as the broader data ecosystem in which they're a part and the obligations that the vendors within that ecosystem have to their governments. Taking this more holistic approach to due diligence will better ensure that data can be protected in a more effective way. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you so much, Ms. Hoffman. And now we're going to turn to Yachu Wang. Welcome.
Chairman Merkley, Chairman McGovern, members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to speak on this issue dear to my heart. I owe my presence here today to the relative internet freedom China once had and to America's commitment to freedom of information. I was born and grew up in China. As a teenager, every day I would go online and listen to Voice of America's Special English, a news program broadcast in slow-speed English. That's how I started to learn English. And that's also how I and many others in China got information uncensored by the Chinese government. That was 15 years ago. And Beijing has since got so much better at controlling the internet. It's not only that many foreign websites are blocked, that people inside China can't access websites outside of China, but also that many people from China who now live in the US, with the free internet readily accessible to them, they would still go back to the censored Chinese internet to get news information. I'd like to use my 5 minutes to focus on Wechat and TikTok, two Chinese apps that have a significant presence in the US. First and foremost, it's essential to remember that all Chinese tech companies are subject to the control of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese diaspora heavily relies on the super app Wechat for information, communication, and political organizing. This heavy reliance on this one app for everything gives Beijing huge latitude to shape the diaspora's views in ways more favorable to the CCP. It allows Beijing to know a lot about the people who have left China, down to things like who is meeting whom, at what time, and where. And it also allows Beijing to potentially mobilize an important demographic in the US. Early this year, a network of fake social media accounts linked to the Chinese government attempted, but failed, to draw Americans out to real-world protests against racial injustice. The reason we know about this is because it happened on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, American tech companies that are comparatively more transparent, that periodically disclose influence operations, and that are under more public scrutiny. We do not know whether similar schemes targeting the Chinese diaspora are happening on Wechat because it's hard to do research. Then there's TikTok, which has far deep reach into the lives of the American public, especially young people. One thing lawmakers need to understand is that what you see on TikTok is not so much decided by who you follow, but by the company's algorithm. There's no way for outsiders to know what information is being suppressed or promoted on TikTok that is due to the Chinese government's influence. If you search the hashtag Xinjiang, you will find many videos with smiling and dancing Uyghurs, but not so many videos that is about the camps and surveillance and the human rights sufferings. Why is this the case? We don't know. In short, there's a lot we don't know about what Chinese tech companies are doing in the US, what is being censored, promoted, and suppressed, and how data is being accessed, used, and shared. And to what extent it's the Chinese government that is telling them to do these things. But we can know it, and it's up to you, people in the Congress, to make it happen. Congress has recently increased its scrutiny of American tech companies. Chinese tech companies' rising popularity in the US and their ties to the Chinese government should give added urgency to pass laws to require tech companies to be more transparent in their operation and to protect user data. Lastly, here I speak not as an expert, but as a member of the Chinese immigrant community in America. I urge the US government to invest in Chinese language journalism and the media. Making fact-based information available in our native language is one of the most effective ways to counter Beijing's malign influence. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wong. And we now turn to Mr. Jonathan Hillman. Welcome.
Chairman Merkley, Chairman McGovern, members of the Commission, thank you for holding this important hearing. Briefly, I'd like to underscore 4 points from my written testimony, which focuses on China's digital Silk Road. First, China is positioning itself as the developing world's primary provider of digital infrastructure, and it stands to reap both commercial and strategic benefits in the coming years if it is uncontested. There's an urgency to China's activities, which are expanding out of necessity and opportunity. As China's tech companies face greater scrutiny in advanced economies, they are doubling down in the developing world. Huawei, for example, in recent years has signed dozens of deals with foreign governments to provide cloud infrastructure and e-government services. There's also great demand for digital infrastructure. Nearly half of the world still lacks access to reliable internet. Africa, which has about 17% of the world's population, has less than 1% of the world's installed data center capacity. So the opportunity for growth is vast. The United States can engage with these emerging economies and benefit US workers and companies, or it can allow China to cement a position of strength. Second, security concerns, serious as they are, will not win this competition. In much of the world, cost trumps security. Competing will require expanding the availability of affordable, responsible alternatives. Consider China's safe city exports, which its companies claim will reduce crime, increase economic growth, and even help fight the pandemic. Those promises, packaged with financing, can give the impression that these systems will essentially pay for themselves. But we know that these systems are also vulnerable. In addition to raising serious human rights concerns, there are basic questions about their performance and examples of systems failing or not delivering the benefits they promise. These shortcomings open the door for the United States and its allies to offer responsible alternatives. Decision makers in developing countries need more than a reason to say no to China's offers. They need something to say yes to. They're looking for partners that promote development without fueling dependency. Third, the United States has several advantages that it can leverage to compete. US companies are playing catch up in 5G in some respects, but they remain ahead in several important areas, as well as emerging technologies that could shift the playing field in favor of US interests. For example, US companies are leading efforts to provide global broadband from low Earth orbit satellite constellations. US companies offer top quality cloud services, smart city systems, and data centers. In other words, the United States already has many of the essential ingredients to compete, but in some cases, it needs to do a better job of bringing those ingredients together and competing on cost. The United States has another powerful asset that China does not, a network of partners and allies. Several promising efforts are underway to mobilize and operationalize common concerns about China's digital activities and provide alternatives, including the G7's Build Back Better World Partnership, the Trilateral Infrastructure Partnership, the Blue Dot Network, and efforts through the Quad and the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. All of these efforts will need resources to succeed. Finally, Congress and the executive branch have important roles to play in helping the United States win this competition, even though this competition is happening often in the private sector. They can help sharpen the US toolkit by enabling the US Development Finance Corporation to do more, expanding the US commercial service, and updating defense partnerships to include a greater focus on technology. And they can expand the availability of affordable alternatives by making additional resources available for the Build Back Better World Partnership and related allied efforts, supporting technical assistance and capacity building programs overseas, and using trade policy to lead on digital issues. Additional recommendations are included in my written testimony. None of this is going to be cheap, easy, or fast, but the United States has much to offer the developing world and much to gain by expanding the availability of affordable, responsible alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for your testimony. We're now going to turn to opportunities for members of the Congress to ask questions and ask you to keep your responses fairly brief and to the point so that we can get in as many questions as possible. I will begin and start, Mr. Kane, with your observation that individuals, for example, Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region, experience continuous monitoring by technology, and that monitoring is directed into a system, the Integrated Joint Operation Platform, which then triggers various officials to go and question individuals, and that can result from which door they used, whether they were late for work, whether they had changes in their physical exercise, all of which pushes people into kind of a robotic world in which they are extraordinarily careful about what they say and what they do, and in addition, not just about how they conduct themselves daily, but erasing their sense of culture and heritage. What you're describing does kind of feel like it's out of a science fiction future, but it's here today, and the technologies are increasing very quickly. As you look down the road, do you see China expanding the use of these technologies into additional communities within China? And are you seeing that authoritarian figures around the world are seeking out this Chinese model and technologies to be able to use these strategies within their own countries? And if so, if you can give us a couple examples, it'd be helpful.
Certainly, thank you. So yes, I do full-heartedly agree with the assessment you just gave, that this does feel like a science fiction novel. And when I was in Xinjiang, it truly felt as if I was walking through the George Orwell world of 1984. So to answer the second part of your question, there has already been a widespread attempt by both Chinese technology companies with the support of Chinese Communist Party officials to expand the use of these technologies, often under the guise of projects called safe cities or under the guise of fighting crime or law enforcement, but often in reality used by authoritarian governments or quasi-authoritarian governments around the world to oppress their political opponents and dissidents and other people whom they find troublesome. So in my written testimony, I did list a few examples that have been reported in recent years. These reports picked up in 2019 and have been continuing to pick up more. This is not a problem that's ending in any way soon. So to give one example here, in 2019, the government of Uzbekistan, as reported in the Wall Street Journal, announced that it was going to adopt a safe city system in its capital, Tashkent, with 883 cameras. Excuse me. And in very Orwellian terms, the government announced that they would use these cameras and this system to, quote, digitally manage political affairs, unquote. And just keeping in mind, this is an authoritarian government with a deep history of harassing and imprisoning dissidents. Another example is Uganda in sub-Saharan Africa. The Wall Street Journal reported in August 2019 that technicians from Huawei, the major technology firm that makes smartphones and servers, helped the government access the Facebook pages and phones and messages of opposition bloggers who were criticizing the president. Now, Huawei did deny this allegation, but some of its employees have stated repeatedly in the press that they see their role as simply providing the technology and not necessarily following up on its political uses or human rights considerations. Those are two examples I can name. I hope that my information answers your question. Was there anything else you would like to ask me to go over?
Thank you. Right now, that's great. I wanted to get those examples into the record and just note that we anticipate that this will spread to additional countries where authoritarian governments are seeking to control targeted populations or their population as a whole. I want to turn to Ms. Wang. And Ms. Wang, you noted that the diaspora of China uses WeChat. I assume that this is, one, they're familiar with it. Two, it gives them a connection to their expanded families and friends back in China. But you note that one of your recommendations is that we should pursue open source technology that would provide people in China the ability to circumvent censorship more easily, and I assume folks outside of China to also be able to communicate and avoid the Chinese control of that social media. What prevents China from simply blocking such alternative open source technology? Is there a feasible technological route to bypass WeChat?
Thank you for a question. There are currently ways to bypass China's Great Firewall, but it's always cat and mouse catch game. There are VPNs available, and the Chinese government blocks those VPNs. Then there are more new ways to circumvent the censorship come up. Then the Chinese block them again. So it's always the creativity to create new ways to circumvent the censorship is competing with the Chinese government's own creativity to block it. So I think in order to win this war, we need more investment in those technologies. We need to get better than the Chinese government in circumventing the internet censorship. I think there are investments currently by the U.S. government on those tools, but I think there are. In the previous years, there are tools, but they are not open source technologies. By open source technologies, the third party can look into those technologies to make sure they're transparent. They don't have loopholes, so people around the world can work together. I attend those, off-the-record conference talking to app developers who have a heart for internet freedom, and they work together. And I think the U.S. government can play a role to make this happen and in a better way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Hillman. This month's cover story for The Atlantic, entitled "It's The Bad Guys Are Winning," is about an alliance of autocrats. It notes that the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Egyptians not only detained and deported Uyghurs, but have also purchased Chinese surveillance technology. In which countries has the Chinese model of mass surveillance and censorship advanced the furthest? And what U.S. programs can promote sustainable, transparent, global infrastructure financing as alternatives to Belt and Road? And if not, are there gaps in U.S. Authorities or tools that Congress could address to bolster these programs?
Thank you for the question. You know, there are unfortunately, too many examples to name of these safe city projects overseas. We did a study in 2018 just of Huawei's safe city projects. We found 73 agreements across 52 countries, with a lot of that activity in Asia and Africa. Pakistan, I believe, had the most agreements of any single country. I think that there is an opportunity here for the United States and its allies to offer a superior alternative. I mean, we're actually already cooperating in some ways on this technology. The city of Las Vegas has a smart city that is provided in part by Dell, a US company, and by NTT, a Japanese company. I think we need to do more, though, to set standards that is going to drive this competition to compete at a higher level rather than being a race to the bottom. I would love to see, an allied alternative for a sustainable city that emphasizes environmental sustainability, that emphasizes social responsibility, that emphasizes data security. We have the companies who are working in these areas. I think we need to bring it together, and we need to offer financing. I think your question about can we do more, does the U.S. government have the tools it needs, is a really important question, because what we see China doing is effectively selling products that are not the best, but come with low costs and financing, and that's a very attractive proposition and sometimes difficult to turn down. One really concrete improvement that could be made is to allow the U.S. Development Finance Corporation to do more with its equity authority. That's a new authority that the DFC has, but its hands are a little bit tied right now in terms of its ability to use that authority. I think that's really one area where Congress and the executive branch could make a change that would have a difference. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Hoffman, your testimony calls for collaboration with like-minded countries to develop systems for improving risk-based approaches to improving the regulation of data transfers. Can you give us a sense of the bureaucratic landscape and challenges in this? Which department should be the lead, or does this require top-level direction from the White House?
Thank you. So I think I'll first just say that the biggest issue with our current risk-based assessment is that we tend to assume that technology is either good or bad, and we look at this issue in a black and white way. But really what we're talking about with a lot of digital and data-driven technologies, certainly the ones covered in my testimony, is that they're always, in a sense, and for lack of a better term, dual use, because the data derived from these technologies can be valuable for many different reasons, and it largely depends on the intent of the actor who has access to that data. What they intend to do with it. And it could be multiple things. You could be talking about problem solving, and you could talk about enhancing capacity for control. In my testimony, for instance, I give an example of technologies or different databases, essentially, that all feed into normal everyday problem solving, traffic management, but then also political legal control, feeding into the National Defense Mobilization System. So there are a number of ways that technologies can be used to contribute value, or these data sets can contribute value to a lot of different things at once. So that being said, I think that this requires really a whole of government approach. Of course, leadership from the White House is encouraged on this issue, but I think that there's not any one particular department that can lead on this. I think that the main thing that needs to be done actually is we need to invest in the kind of research that would allow us to decide a better metric for judging risk. Because right now, the way that we do that is quite black and white. We look at the security implications of technology, but forget, for instance, I wrote a paper on a company called Global Tone Communications Technology, which provides translation services. But with the data that it collects, it's a company that's controlled by China's Central Propaganda Department. It embeds its products in Huawei and AliCloud and other places. It collects data in 67 languages and uses that to support propaganda. So there are different ways that we have to imagine risk, and right now we don't have the correct toolkit to be able to respond.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question. I don't know if I can fit it in a minute here, but Mr. Kane, I want to thank you for your endorsement of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. You know, one of the challenges with ensuring goods are not made with forced labor is the unreliability of audits. As the administration's Xinjiang Business Advisory notes, do you think that the extreme levels of surveillance in Xinjiang add to that unreliability, and does it mean that monitored workers are unable to speak freely about their experiences to auditors without risk of exposure?
Yes, that is correct, and I think that this has been well documented now in numerous news sources and academic reports on the region. There is a serious problem of extreme surveillance simply overpowering whatever audit function can exist within your typical multinational or American corporation that operates in the region of Xinjiang. There have been reports already of corporate auditors being sent to the region to fulfill these audits, but they have been detained and harassed by authorities in Xinjiang. And just on the basis of that alone, we can reasonably conclude that whatever information is being given to the auditors who might be succeeding in obtaining some degree of information is deeply unreliable and almost certainly covers up the fact that there is a massive problem in the region of this slavery and forced labor. I don't quite see a way around that. When you consider, just that the surveillance is so deep, I think that in whatever legislation is to hopefully be passed eventually, there must be a presumption, a rebuttable presumption that whatever goods or whatever exports are originating in Xinjiang have been touched by forced labor in some way.
Thank you.
Congressman Smith. Congressman Smith, we don't have you. I know you're joining us electronically. If we don't have you, we'll continue with Senator Lang.
Hello? You have me now?
We have your voice, but not yet your picture. There we are. Okay.
Okay. Thank you
Welcome.
for your patience. I don't know what happened. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our very distinguished witnesses. Tremendous testimony. Let me just very briefly, I mentioned that hearing that I did in 2006 with Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and Yahoo, 4 of them. I asked them under oath, because I swore them all in, how do they respond when somebody says they want personally identifiable information about a dissident, a human rights activist? And they said they just follow orders, reminiscent of another regime going back to the 1930s, just following orders to give up all of this information, and many people went to prison because of it. And the multi-decade transfer of technology that has enabled this brutal dictatorship called the Chinese Communist Party is just appalling. And now, maybe our distinguished witnesses might want to speak to, that New York Times piece. China still buys American DNA equipment for Xinjiang despite blocks. That was October 22nd of a couple of weeks ago. Ms. Wang, you made some really great points about WeChat and TikTok, how they store information for at least 6 months. And I wonder if the diaspora is any way aware of that, that this is all being stored. Google, under a great deal of pressure, gives people an ability to, at least at about 18 months, to get rid of some of the information that they seem to store forever. And I'm wondering, has anybody been arrested pursuant to the information that has been stored on WeChat, or people back home harassed? Because it's just like sitting there as low-hanging fruit for the ubiquitous Chinese secret police to do whatever they want. And finally, I have a lot of questions, but there's not enough time. We, in a bipartisan way, keep pushing for stronger enforcement, good laws, and yet I'm wondering if it's being prioritized sufficiently. There's one thing to say, we're all for you. We want to make sure that the internet and certainly all of these apps are not being used to track and to incarcerate. But is it being prioritized sufficiently within the U.S. Department of State, past administration as well as this one? I don't want to be in any way partisan, because I have been unhappy with all Democrat and Republicans since I and Speaker Pelosi and I and others so vigorously oppose MFN without human rights conditionality. You don't trade with a dictatorship and think you're somehow going to matriculate to a democracy. They get more potent and more capabilities to do wrong. So if you could speak to those issues. Ms. Wang, maybe I'll start with you.
Thank you for a question. I'm a member of the Chinese immigrant community here. I would just simply say that it's impossible not to use WeChat to live your life. I don't have WeChat on this phone, but I have WeChat on another phone just to separate the data. For example, if I go to a Chinese restaurant, they offer a discount, and that discount only exists on the app on WeChat. You cannot get a discount through your Facebook or other social media app. I wanted to mail something back to China, and I have to use WeChat in order for this to work. And because of that kind of ecosystem, so, among immigrants in the United States, we are all living here, have a job here, we communicate with each other on WeChat. And just this convenience provided by WeChat sucked us all into the system. The question is whether we are aware of the problem. Obviously, we know that government censor, survey our communication. But I think people just resign to the fact that this is our way of living. I make a concerted effort that I only have WeChat on another phone. When I need to use it, I use that phone. But most people, if you just have a day job that work as an accountant, what's the point, right? So that allows the Chinese government to have huge latitude to collect information and shape views. One good example I would give you is that in the past, there are local newspapers in New York where I live that cater to the Chinese diaspora. Now, in order for the local newspapers to be read by the Chinese diaspora here, those newspaper has to go through the WeChat because people only read the news on WeChat. So in a way that the local news information catering to the Chinese diaspora has to go through the Beijing censorship before it delivers to you. That is the kind of control the Chinese government is able to exert on the Chinese diaspora. Whether there are evidence that the people have been arrested because of what they say on WeChat. Yes, there's a good story done by the New York Times. There's a woman who lives in Canada. She was just using WeChat talking. I think it criticized the Chinese government. When she went back to China, she got arrested. It's all because of what she said in Canada. This is, a story that is disclosed, and she is willing to talk about it. I'm sure there are many stories of people who have no awareness, their communication is being, looked, and when they go back to China, they, got detained. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wang. Would anybody else want to speak to the prioritization of this issue? Is it being sufficiently prioritized within the U.S. government?
I'd be happy to speak.
Please, thank you, Dr. Hoffman.
So I think first, and just to reiterate the points that Ms. Wang just made, I know so many stories, just in interviews that I've conducted and through my own network of people who have been harassed while they're overseas for the digital communications. And in some cases, I know of one particularly disturbing case where the person concerned and their family were both permanent residents or citizens of liberal democracies. And the family, in one case, was harassed by Chinese embassy authorities about the other family members' activity online, and they were harassed in person. Sorry to be vague, but I think it's important to protect the identity of those people. And I know of a number of other cases along similar lines where people receive threats online as well, and it's a very real problem. Now, in terms of the prioritization, I think that, I mean, I always say that the US government and other governments around the world aren't prioritizing these issues enough. But I will say that increasingly there is an awareness of the problem. I think that the issue is that sometimes we think that okay, now we're aware of it, we'll solve the problem. Whereas actually, I don't think we've adequately defined it yet. And that's why in my testimony, I talk a little bit more about how we conceptualize the issue of tech authoritarianism, where we aren't just talking about the most coercive use of technology, we're also talking about the export of normal, everyday problem-solving technologies, not just to other authoritarian or liberal regimes, but to democracies, including the United States. And so until we adequately define the problem, any policy responses that we develop aren't going to truly address the nature of the problem. And so my concern is that we're sometimes jumping ahead with solutions before we've identified the problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. We're now
Thank you,
turning to Senator Lankford.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you all the witnesses and the truth that you're bringing to light. It's exceptionally helpful to be able to continue to get the facts, to be able to come to the forefront. I do have some follow-up here that I want to be able to talk to Ms. Hoffman about. Mr. Hillman had mentioned there are 52 countries right now that they know of that have the safe cities technology in it. My question is, how is the Chinese government not just using that data in these 52 different countries that have the safe cities technology, not how those countries are using it? How is China using that data that they're then harvesting from those 52 countries that are using the safe cities technology?
Thanks, sir, for your question. I think there's evidence. Some of this is tough to study in open sources, but there's evidence to suggest that there are vulnerabilities in these projects that are putting at risk the data in the countries that are using them and potentially giving access to that data to Chinese authorities. So, for example, in Pakistan, there's actually a legal case underway with a company that was involved in developing a safe city project there that alleges that it was forced to install a backdoor that would allow access to data from Beijing. There's also been examples of hardware being discovered on surveillance cameras where Pakistani engineers were not initially made aware of that hardware. Hardware that could allow you to gain access remotely to those systems. So we see these examples of data challenges. There's a good example in Papua New Guinea, which borrowed money from China and allowed Huawei to build a data center there. And when a third party did a study of that data center, the conclusion that they reached was that the security was so poorly designed that it was probably intentionally designed that way. So I think that there's ample signs to be concerned about some of the espionage risk. There's also, in some cases, a commercial incentive for China's large providers of surveillance equipment to collect data on foreign populations so that they can improve their algorithms and the ability of their algorithms to recognize foreign faces, for example. And sometimes, I've heard just anecdotally that giving access to that data might result in getting, some preferential financing for the project. So there's both an intelligence concern here as well as a potential commercial angle for some of the Chinese companies that are involved.
Ms. Hoffman, do you want to add to that?
Yes, thank you. So one issue that I'd like to cover is the way that Chinese companies can derive value out of data without any sort of malicious disruption or break-in. Because I think oftentimes we focus on the risk of espionage with PRC technologies, but the other part we miss is that with a company, any company like Huawei, Alibaba, others, they're providing a service. And at the same time, it depends on who sits within their supply chain. That there could be automatic access to the kinds of data that they collect. That's described in my written testimony. It's the first figure. I think it helps to explain that concept a little bit more. But then it's also the concept that I describe in a paper from 2019 called Engineering Global Consent about the propaganda department company I mentioned earlier. Now, that being said, I think that the recent data security law, as well as the personal information protection law and the PRC, further illustrate what we already know about the ways that the Chinese party state can exert pressure on companies and other individuals and entities to access data whenever it chooses. So in particular, the data security law says that the data security in China is governed by the state security concept, which is ultimately about the party state's political security, and that's what makes it different from national security. And it also says that in Article 2 of the law, it says that data handling activities taking place outside the PRC, if those activities are seen to harm state security, the public interest, and the lawful rights of interests of citizens and organizations in the PRC, then they can be pursued for legal responsibility in accordance with the law. Now, what could be harming state security? Well, that could be the political opponents of the CCP we were discussing earlier, but it could be anything that the party state sees as potentially undermining its power. And so essentially, there are no limits to the party state's power in this case. Companies might say, well, we don't want to hand over data. We aren't going to do that. But ultimately, if they're operating in the PRC and they're based in the PRC, they're bound by PRC law.
So if there is a company that's a Chinese-owned company that's a quote-unquote privately owned, non-state-owned company that's functioning in the United States or in any other country, and they're sending data back to China, that data can be owned and can be captured then by the Chinese government, or the actions of that company can then be overseen by the Chinese government, correct?
Yes.
Shuang, there's been a lot of conversation about a social score for Chinese citizens that in the surveillance state that they live under, that they're all graded internally and receive some sort of scoring, and they get access to mass transportation, to jobs, to moving, to being able to have the ability to travel overseas. What do you know about the social scoring of individuals in China?
It's a social credit score system. It's currently in its form, it's mostly a blacklist. So, for example, if you have not fulfilled your obligations, such as you had a loan that you didn't pay on time, then you would have been be listed on the on this list, and then it would affect your daily life. Maybe when you go to train station, you cannot buy a ticket because because of your record of not paying a loan. And it doesn't not only affect you, it also affect your family. And there are instances that children cannot be enrolled into the school system because their parents have not paid the loan. So it's a punishment by guilty by association. I mean, currently, the data are not in one the data has not been integrated in different places that in different localities. There are different systems, and it is the Chinese government's ultimate goal to have all the data integrated into one giant database. So they can have access to it, and no matter where you're based, and they can exert what a kind of punishment against you based on whatever the things you have done. I mean, even look at the currently the health code, right? That it was developed during the COVID time. Right now, this health code is being used against political dissidents and human rights lawyers. Because you have to have the code to travel, right? It has to be a green code. But you as a human rights lawyer, you are here for the past months, you have done nothing, and you have a red code, and it's a health code. It shows your health risk, but this has nothing to do with your health situation. It's entirely, you're a human rights lawyer, and now you have a red code and you cannot travel. So, this is like, the point is that the government can construe it as, we try to build a social credit system that is for the good of society, but it can be used in other ways to, to carry out their political goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. We're now going to turn to Congresswoman Steele, to be followed by Senator King, and then Congresswoman Swazi, and then Senator Ossoff.
Thank you,
Congresswoman Steele.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. And thank you all the witnesses coming out today, because this is very important issue. And China continues to cheat and abuse the global rule-based system. And China cannot be transparent world leader and continue to strip Hong Kong's rightful freedoms and autonomy and allow forced labor in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And world leaders cannot continue to allow China to abuse its own citizens and threaten those who live in other countries too. So all the witnesses, whoever can answer these questions, and I'm just so grateful for that. The United States called out China for their abuses in development of a 5G network, yet many U.S. companies are investing in China's semiconductor industry. So what threats does that pose, and what messages does that send to the rest of the world? If any witnesses can answer, I'm grateful.
Yes, without a doubt, the problem of major multinational corporations and American corporations investing in the Chinese semiconductor industry, which is heavily state-backed, which has the enormous support of various state coalitions and bodies within China, is a major threat to both American industrial and security interests. This is something that, speaking more historically, there has long been American business interest in investing in East Asian semiconductor markets. So Japan was the original one, then South Korea, Taiwan, and now the People's Republic of China is trying to build its own semiconductor industry, and this has been going on for about 2 decades now. It's one of the core technologies to ensuring that these surveillance technologies can actually function. But I would just like to point out that there is a bill that has been on the floor already let me just double check. I think it was the House, yes, introduced in 2020, the Chips for America Act, which is HR 7178. I read the legislation. I thought it was very well written. It was a bill that I came on in my own research. It was just something that popped up, and I think it does do potentially great work, because it offers subsidies and investments to ensuring that America can continue to produce its own semiconductors, and that we can bring manufacturing home. I think this is ultimately the solution to protecting our own interests and our own democracy and security, from infiltration and from the meddling of the Chinese Communist Party.
Thank you very much for that answer, because we have a supply chain crisis too. So manufacturing companies coming back here, and then we are building our own here. I think it's going to make life much easier, and we can stop China not abusing these businesses. So my second question is, China must abide by the international rules. If they fails to do so, the U.S. and democratic partners must hold China accountable. It's very, very tough to do, because they're not really transparent. So as China becomes a leader in artificial intelligence, how dangerous is this to the future threats of human rights abuse that they are doing it right now? And does China's digital currency plans add to this abuse?
I'd be happy to comment on that.
Yes, please.
So I did some research last year on China's digital currency, and I think that's actually a great. I don't feel like I'm an expert, particularly on digital currencies, but on DCEP, I think the most interesting thing is actually the technology itself, rather than the currency or the concept of the digital yuan. I think it's the technology behind it. Now, it's all very much in development. And I think that this is an area where other countries can get ahead. But I think the same issue with digital currency related technologies as with anything else, smart cities related. You know, if China is ahead in setting standards, and what I tend to look at would be that, you know, domestically, it's technical committees that are setting standards, and those involve, say, if you're talking about facial recognition systems, that could involve the PLA research institutes and People's Armed Police or Ministry of Public Security research institutes, along with companies like Huawei and Dahua and others. And then those technologies, when they're exported, would embed those standards that are being designed within the PRC. So in order to get ahead of any potential violations of human rights or undermining of liberal democracy, I think that's where we need to get ahead in terms of standard setting, and that's where we also need a lot more research. And DCEP is an interesting issue, or China's digital currency electronic payment system, because it's still very much in development. So while it's not necessarily a threat today, it's potentially an issue that we will face a number of years down the line. And so getting ahead of it from a policy perspective is encouraged, so that we don't continue with the sort of whack-a-mole approach that's been taken with companies like Huawei.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn to Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a fascinating hearing, and I think it's interesting to note that George Orwell was right as a matter of fiction back when 1984 was written. I thought he was wrong in the 80s when the fax machine and mobile phones allowed a flowering of individual rights across the world, and in fact contributed in the early part of this century to the Arab Spring. Now we're learning he was right, because technology is being used aggressively for repressive purposes. Ms. Wang, a couple of questions. Are the Chinese people aware of the level of internet censorship? Do they know that they're not getting the whole picture? I'm talking about ordinary people who are, you know, a clerk in a factory who goes home and goes on the internet. Do they know that they're being censored?
I think people generally have an idea, but I think the censorship in recent years had got so bad that, you know, people have a general awareness that, you know, my conversation is being censored, I don't get the full picture, but that they don't know exactly which information I got is being censored. I can speak for my family because many members of my own family believe the COVID-19 originated from the US, because the Chinese government just has been so heavy on propagating this idea. It's hard to talk them out of it. And, you know, they are in China, they haven't gone out of China for several years, and they don't have alternative information.
So the Chinese people are as subject to disinformation as we are?
Yes, I mean, the Chinese government is, you know, has much latitude in spreading disinformation inside the country, because there's no counter-information. They are the only spreader of disinformation.
So to answer my question, you said people are somewhat aware. Are they? My next question, and this, well, the second one is, are they aware of the extent to which they're being surveilled?
I would say that people have a general idea, but, you know, in terms of specific, you know, people, people don't believe that. Why would the Chinese government look into how am I talking to my wife, right? Until one day, you know, the government, this police summoned you saying, you know, you were chatting this to your wife, you know, you're bad-mouthing the police. And then they would say, wow, I can't believe they are looking into this. Because people just generally think, you know, what's the point? Why? I'm nobody. Why are you looking at my thing?
But they are aware.
Generally, yes, generally.
No,
but
okay.
They wouldn't think, you know, specifically. It's just, you know, people think that the government is looking at everybody. But why it's me, right? It's like, you know, everybody has an equal chance being hit by the bus. Only when you hit by the bus, you say, oh, it happened to me right now.
So as people are gaining awareness of, A, the extent to which information is being censored, B, the extent to which they're being fed information that may not be true by the government, and C, that they're being surveilled. Is there any resistance? Is there any resentment? Does anybody care about this?
I mean, there are absolute resentment. One obvious example is after the COVID, the early days of COVID, which got spread was because the Chinese government initially suppressed the information. You can just see.
Do people know that? Do they know that people died because of the government's actions?
Initially, yes. Yes, people are aware the local Wuhan government was suppressing information.
So my question is, are they angry? Are they resentful? Is there any resistance being built up? Is this developing a political resistance to the surveillance state, or is it hopeless?
Well, I think initially people were very angry when the COVID just happened, but then later the government was so good at disinformation. They were saying, we did such a good job of trying to contain the virus. And look at America, everybody is dying. It's necessary. We have to control the information. Then people were angry first. Now they were happy with the government's control. So it's an ebb and a flow. I think generally people have a kind of discontent and anger, but it's heavily suppressed.
Well, we have a tradition here of free speech, of the First Amendment, and sort of fierce individual liberty impulses. Is there something in Chinese history and culture that makes the Chinese people more likely to tolerate this kind of central control over their lives? Does this go back to the Han Dynasty, or I'm trying to get at a cultural rationale for this acceptance?
I don't think it's cultural. It's entirely political. You have experienced the Cultural Revolution, the Great Famine, and millions of people died. You internalize that message, do not criticize the government. 1989 happened. You tried to criticize the government. Your body was rolled over by a tank. That's a message that do not criticize the government. And I mean,
So it's garden variety intimidation.
Yes. And I think, for my generation, I'm 34 years old, or people younger than me, if you were born into a situation that you have never experienced the freedom, you don't know how it feels to be free. I mean, I was born in China, and I lived in the U.S. for over 10 years. I can feel the difference that if you have not experienced the freedom, you don't know how it feels to be free.
Changing the subject a bit, Mr. Hillman, we talked a lot about the spread of the Chinese technology, Huawei particularly. Are any of these countries experiencing buyer's remorse? Is there a realization that that they've given up something substantial, or are they just happy they got a better deal?
I think that there definitely are instances of buyer's remorse. We've seen a little bit of that in Pakistan. Some politicians have made comments about how, at one point, one Safe City project, about half the cameras weren't working. And so, there are these instances of disappointment, of promises not being delivered. But it's a political challenge, too, because the incentives are not really there for the leaders, the decision makers that approved these systems and probably had a big ceremony around their announcement to own up to the fact that they might not be performing.
Well, I'm running out of time, but if we were talking about future potential customers, is it a matter of us just developing our own good server and equipment and subsidizing it like they do? Do we have to, that's inconsistent with our theory of the market, but do we have to fight fire with fire and otherwise we're just standing by and watching them wire the world?
Yes, we need to package the parts together. We need to bring together not only the hard infrastructure, but the services and training too. Training is really attractive. And you need financing in some cases to make this look feasible up front and to make it competitive. As we do that, though, it's not only about providing just a different option, but I think we do want to be offering a superior option, one that we have evidence that works, and one that comes with some safeguards, too, that's going to prevent some of the harms that we see when these systems are used in the wrong way.
Well, of course, part of the problem is some of these authoritarian regimes want that surveillance capacity that we may be reluctant to supply them with. Well, thank you all very much for your testimony. This is a very important hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator King. And we'll turn to Congresswoman Swazi.
Yes, Congressman Swazi.
Congressman
Senator.
Swazi, thank you.
You're gender neutral in the Senate over there. I want to first, this is terrifying, what's going on, and I want to thank the chairman for sounding the alarm on this very important issue. I want to thank the witnesses for the work they've done, the books they've written, the articles they've written, the work that they've done worldwide to try and expose this. I think that the world is coming to realize that, our view that ever since Nixon went to China, that the more that China was exposed to us, the more they'd become like us with democracy and capitalism, just hasn't happened. And the Uyghurs is the worst example of their crimes against humanity, but there are so many other things with the Tibetans and Hong Kong. And now this use of technology is really the terrifying thing that we face. And when I was in 7th grade, I remember Sister Ruth saying, the world is moving so quickly these days, we haven't had a chance to figure out how this is affecting us. And, now things are moving at such a rapid pace, and the world we don't realize how technology is affecting us in so many different ways. And I remember when we were little kids, we would watch shows and they'd say, if only he used his genius for good instead of evil. There are great things that are happening with technology, facial recognition and voice recognition and iris recognition, gait recognition. This could all be very positive things that can be used. I use Clear when I go to the airport, but this is being manipulated by the Chinese Communist Party for domination of people. And we have to expose to the world what's going on. I was very interested with Ms. Wong's comment, which she said we have to get more Chinese-speaking journalists to report on this, because we have to advise people as to what's happening. And, it's so scary, this idea that people are changing their behavior so they don't trigger the artificial intelligence surveillance monitors, so that they try and just stay, very robotic. I mean, that's terrifying. We talked about the effect of Wechat on the Chinese diaspora, but there are many groups that use Wechat even beyond the Chinese diaspora, so they're monitoring that as well. And TikTok is used by everybody, and they're using that to monitor people's behavior. I want to try and figure out, what can we do to let the world know this is happening? We have to. I don't know how we have to sound the alarm beyond this hearing that this is happening. I think that one of the things that Ms. Wong talked about was the use of social media to sow civil unrest here in the United States of America. I know it's a little bit off topic, but it's so important that the American people realize that this is not just happening out there somewhere. This is invading our lives in WeChat, in TikTok, but also on other American platforms where the Chinese Communist Party, as well as the Russians and the Iranians and the North Koreans, are trying to sow civil unrest in America and elsewhere in the world using our freedoms. Can you give us some examples of what you're aware of regarding that, Ms. Wong? Of how the Chinese Communist Party is trying to sow civil unrest in America?
Well, it's hard to tell because it's hard to do research, and that's one of the recommendations that was in my written submission, that we need to make those tech companies more transparent so people know how they are moderate the content, how they are enforce their moderation, content moderation, what kind of data they are collecting and shared with the Chinese government. So there are ways to know it, and it requires the Congress to pass a law to make it a mandate. I mean, in terms of social unrest, I would give an example of how WeChat is powerful in political organizing in the U.S. So right now, the affirmative action is being, I think it is right now, it's still in the Boston court, and the anti-affirmative action became a movement, and that movement is very much initiated by the Chinese diaspora, and the organizing of that movement is primarily on WeChat. I have no evidence whether Chinese government is interested or not, but the idea is that a very important civil rights movement in the United States, and that organizing of this movement is very, is on a platform that is controlled by the Chinese government that can be manipulated by the Chinese government. This is definitely a source for concern. I mean, in terms of other protests, whether the Chinese government is playing a role. I mean, I live in New York City. There are anti-Asian racist protests, other different kind of protests concerning the Chinese diaspora. Again, it's happening on WeChat. The organizing is on WeChat. We don't know whether Chinese government plays a role or not, and we can know,
It's
if the
very
Congress make it
important.
happen.
I think it's very important. First of all, this is happening elsewhere in the world as they're trying to export their technology through the safe cities, as you said, and the social scores and everything else that they're trying to export, the technology that they're trying to export, and so they can have control of this data and build this massive data base of people throughout the world. But we need to get the American people more interested in this topic. And anything that you can do to help us understand, for example, I know that the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, was doing a presentation at a Queens museum, just right outside my district, where they were completely misrepresenting the history of the Tibetan Buddhists. And the people in the communities, stood up and fought to get that removed. And we know how they've used the Confucius centers to try and spread disinformation. And I know about an example of a New York City police officer that's of Tibetan descent that was actually working with the Chinese Communist Party to surveil Tibetans in the area he was responsible for patrolling. So we need to figure out how we can let people know what the Chinese government is doing, the Chinese Communist Party is doing, that's actually affecting us here in the United States now, so we can get them more and more interested in this and try and expose, how they're trying to export these ideas, utilizing these. So anything you could just throw out there in the few seconds I have left, I would appreciate. Anything that you can give us as examples of really abusive behavior. Miss Hoffman.
Yes, thank you. I think that it's a challenging question. It's one that's incredibly important. I mean, I think that the biggest issue that we have here is perhaps one that Ms. Wong highlighted in a previous response, which is that people tend to think that, well, I'm not going to be affected. It's not me. It's hard to conceptualize something that is quite abstract, actually, for a lot of people. It's very real and palpable for political opponents of the CCP, but it's less obvious to you and me, for instance. And so I think part of it is that we need to have a very clear public conversation about the implications of data collection, about what it means when
But I think my time has expired. I think my time has expired, so I don't want to keep holding up the rest of the people. I'm sorry.
All right, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman. And we'll now turn to Senator Ossoff from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel today. Ms. Wong, you've covered some of this previously, but could you please specify with as much detail as possible the specific tools, technologies, platforms, and their manufacturers and producers that are used by the CCP to surveil and intimidate dissidents and other political opponents abroad?
I think, it goes back to, everybody uses WeChat. So the government has a easy way to get, information, what you're doing. I didn't tell, I chatted with people about me coming to Washington, D.C. The government can, on WeChat, the government can get information just by reading my WeChat. Again, it's that the heavy reliance on this tool gives government a lot of latitude to do that. This is a tool that affects the diaspora. And then if you use other websites or any kind of, technology that are developed in China, the government very much can have access that information that you, and use those tools to, survey you, even you're in the United States. Yeah. I don't know whether I answered your question.
I'd like to offer others on the panel the opportunity to share their expertise on the same question, which is to specify the platforms, technologies, tools, software providers, techniques commonly used by the CCP for purposes of surveillance, intimidation, or other forms of influence projection targeting those outside of Chinese borders. We'll start with you, please, Mr. Kane.
Yes, so I actually interviewed a number of former technology workers from Huawei, SenseTime, and Megvii, and also the company that runs WeChat. One of the things to first bear in mind is that two laws in China, the National Intelligence Law and the National Security Law, passed around 2015 and 2017, I believe, essentially make it a crime to not assist the state with data that they request. That's not the exact wording, but that's essentially the spirit and the fundamental of that particular law. So the technology workers who I spoke with, obviously they've been out of China for a few years. They can't return. But as of 2018, 2019, they can say without any doubt whatsoever that these companies do not need to rely on special cybersecurity lapses or special ways of, hacking into people's phones and stealing their data. It's simply that if there's data that is passing through China and that data is requested by the Ministry of Public Security, the Ministry of State Security, another body, the companies will turn it over. And they gave many specific examples, among my population that I was with for many years, the Uyghur population and the Kazakhs and some of the Tibetans. They provided specific examples of WeChat in particular, simply handing over massive amounts of data from the years 2010 to very recently 2017, 2018. Just simply every text message being stored in servers for 2 years at a time, and then using AI surveillance technology to attempt to find matches between data points to try to predict whether someone might become a terrorist. This AI technology was being deployed by various Chinese ministries, but WeChat was the one that voluntarily, when requested, provided this data. So I don't believe, I haven't found evidence personally yet of a special, backdoor system that's spying on all of us. I think it's simply the CCP asks, and the companies will follow.
Thank you. And continuing with you, Mr. Kane, please, how is that law enforced with respect to U.S. and multinational firms that are doing business in China, locating servers in China, selling products in China?
So just to clarify, you mean, Senator, the ways that we enforce the law here to prevent that from happening in China?
No, enforcement of the national security and surveillance laws by which the Chinese government compels the disclosure of such information from WeChat for U.S. and multinational firms who are doing business in China. In what ways are they subject to such enforcement? What data, perhaps related to U.S. persons, may be disclosed or compelled disclosure to the Chinese authorities on the basis of that law? And Mr. Kane, if you'd prefer, you can feel free to defer to anyone else on the panel who may have greater expertise. Or happy to hear from you on that.
So my understanding of both laws is that they do not have jurisdiction only within the People's Republic of China. It is simply any data that is passing through a server, can be requested by the authorities there. So I have, in the past, I have used WeChat. I no longer use WeChat at all because the security risks have been well documented. But I have called, just experimentally to see what happens. I have called people in Tibet. I have called people in Xinjiang. This was before the terrors that exist now, when things were a little better. But WeChat would show messages, would show a warning that says, you are calling this region, your data is potentially not going to be protected here. There was a little disclosure for a while. I haven't done that lately because I don't want to endanger anybody, but that was something that these software companies, I think, made clear and admitted that this data is not safe.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. And with my remaining 45 seconds, Ms. Hoffman, the Aussie perspective on that question, please.
Thank you. Well, in a recent report called Mapping China's Technology Giants, we highlighted on our website the privacy policies for a lot of the PRC technology companies that we map in this project. It's 27 companies, and one thing that we note is that it's common for all companies globally to state in their privacy policies that your data may be transferred to another country where you aren't residing, and that when that data is transferred, it would be governed by local law. Of course, PRC tech companies say the same, and as Mr. Kane has highlighted, when they're subject to the state security law and the intelligence law, they really don't have a choice, and they aren't even allowed to admit that they've assisted in state security in those cases. I think that the other part of your question, and one that a couple of other questions throughout the hearing have highlighted, is that we aren't just talking about the ways that political opponents of the CCP, that their data can be collected and used. We're also talking about the way that, say, U.S. citizens and other citizens around the world can have their data accessed and used. And of course, we aren't thinking as much about individuals being surveilled. Of course, that does happen. But it's also just about what value data has when it's aggregated. So an example that I once provided is the idea of, Hisense, smart TV provider, being a state-owned company, partly or fully state-owned. I can't remember at the moment. And a smart TV data doesn't sound extremely interesting until you think about that data in aggregate, because what's useful for advertisers would also be useful from a propaganda perspective or in terms of influence operations in the future. So it's not just individuals being tracked. It's also the issue of the value, the strategic value of aggregated data sets.
Thank you, Ms. Hoffman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks so much, Senator Ossoff. And now we're going to turn to Congresswoman Wexton of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the panelists for joining us here today and for your important work in this area. I represent a district here in Northern Virginia, which has one of the highest populations of Uyghur Muslims outside of Xinjiang, and the stories that they tell me are terrifying about what their families are going through back home. And the surveillance doesn't end in Xinjiang or in China. They will talk about how they get a random message on Wechat saying, "Do you want to talk to grandma?" So somebody that they haven't been able to talk to in months. And so when they set up this video call, there will be a Han Chinese member of the PRC sitting on the sofa with grandma. And it's just that kind of intimidation and threats that really are very, very frightening. And Ms. Wong, I want to thank you for all your testimony about what's happening and everything that you've been dealing with. And this whole issue with Wechat is particularly frightening because it is so insidious and so ubiquitous for the Chinese diaspora. And because it's not just disaggregated data, they can focus on a single individual and surveil what they're doing. So it's pretty frightening, and I want to thank you for everything that you've done to draw attention to this issue. But I do want to talk for a minute about the Olympics, which are coming up, around the corner. And I'm very concerned about the PRC's use of surveillance technologies during the Olympics and what risks the athletes in particular will face while in China. And if any of them do choose to speak out about the human rights abuses that are taking place in China nowadays, what sort of retaliatory actions can they expect from the PRC and from the Chinese government? Mr. Kane, if we could start with you on that question.
So it is alarming, I must say, just the fact that Beijing can hold an Olympics, given the state of human rights and the downward trend towards authoritarianism in the country. So when it comes to thinking about ways to raise awareness or to to boycott or to do something to make people notice what's going on in China, I think just more broadly speaking, the Olympics is the moment to do that, because this is going to be a time when all the world's eyes are going to be on China. In 2008, shortly after the Olympics, there were mass protests in Tibet and Xinjiang in 2009, 2010. owing to conditions there, to human rights atrocities and a lack of civil liberties. And that was a moment, I think a rare moment in the past, when the world's eyes were really on just the depth of the suffering that exists in some of these regions. I think that naturally there's going to be a lot more attention on these problems as the Olympics approaches. I'm not totally sure, given all the vested commercial interests, the big advertising deals, I think there's a feeling among many U.S. corporations and foreign companies that I've spoken with personally that we need to not be too loud about China and its own human rights problems in the interest of preserving our own market access and our advertising relationship with the Olympics. I'm not sure quite how to get around that, that one particular problem. I mean, short of continuing to sanction foreign companies that do business in Xinjiang and with other human rights abusing regimes. But I am optimistic in one sense that when the Olympics does happen, there will be a major broadcast coverage of some of the underbellies and some of the human rights atrocities now unfolding.
Thank you. And do you think that there will be any retaliatory action as a result of that?
I think that there already has been a good deal of retaliatory action. There has been in the past 2 or 3 years a vast clampdown, both on human rights in Hong Kong and other parts of China, but also retaliation against foreign journalists who travel to China or who live in China and who have been reporting on these topics. I mean, among my own personal media circles, I can count now on maybe 2 hands, maybe even it could be a few dozen people actually by now who've simply been denied visas or rejected or who have lost their visas as retaliation for their reporting. So without a doubt, I do think that there will be threats from the Chinese Communist Party against major broadcast media that attempt to cover these human rights atrocities as the Olympics are underway. But I think that also the PRC has worked itself into a bit of a hole in this situation because I don't think they have much more leverage, having already yanked the visas of so many foreign journalists in the country who already speak Chinese, who do great coverage of the country. Now that they've been pulled out, they're simply going to, they're going to be sitting in South Korea or Japan now, simply covering these atrocities from the point of view of refugees who have escaped.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kane. And I don't think you'll get any argument from anybody on this panel. We've had a number of hearings about the Olympics and their sponsors and everything, and trying to up the pressure on them in advance of those Olympics taking place. Now, Mr. Hillman, it's clear from your presentation that U.S. firms could compete with firms from the PRC in terms of providing cutting-edge technology and those services across the globe. How can we ensure that the technologies that we're exporting aren't going to be used for surveillance technologies and to advance authoritarianism? And is the PRC currently using any U.S. technology in order to conduct its surveillance activities at home or abroad?
Thanks. It's a challenging question, but I think one that we can do not only just through unilateral action, but also in coordination with partners and allies. And so developing principles for the use of technology, in a way, some of that's being done now through the Quad, which includes the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India. I think there are similar efforts underway through the U.S., EU Trade and Technology Council. And so not only just making alternatives available, but helping to provide technical assistance and training that ensures that these alternatives are being used appropriately. And then we obviously have tools and sanctions to use in instances where they're not being used appropriately. There, unfortunately, are examples of U.S. technology, U.S. products being used. And this is something, unfortunately, that's not new. I think there's a longer history here that goes back to the 1990s and the opening of China's market and the eagerness with which a lot of U.S. companies and other foreign firms wanted to go into that market, their willingness to form joint ventures, to share technology, and still the willingness of some companies to supply components that are needed for these systems. So I do think that that's an area that deserves more attention.
Thank you very much. I see that my time has expired, so I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Wexton, and appreciate your raising the Olympics, which the Congressional-Executive Commission on China has tried to really amplify attention to the fact that we are in this time in which the International Olympic Committee has placed the world's athletes in an untenable position of making them essentially complicit in China's effort to use the Olympics to paint a very beautiful vision of their country and to basically hide the genocide that they are engaged in against the Uyghur community and other ethnic and religious minorities. So it's important that we continue to raise it, that we encourage athletes to speak out, that we encourage sponsors to speak out, we encourage sponsors to condition any future sponsorship on massive reforms by the IOC, that we protect the athletes' ability to speak freely at the games, that we encourage network coverage, cable coverage to explore the underbelly, as referred to by our witness today, and use it as an opportunity to educate the world about China's practices when those Olympics occur. I want to ask one additional topic that I don't think has really been covered today, and that is the challenge that U.S. companies have in operating in China when they are compelled to hand over information. And one particular example that's been well covered has been Airbnb. Sean Joyce, the former chief trust officer of Airbnb, resigned in 2019 because China was requiring Airbnb to hand over not just phone information and email addresses, phone numbers and email addresses, but also messages sent between guests and hosts, in other words, to participate in the surveillance strategy of the country. Many other companies are compelled to share information, and this is just an ongoing challenge that needs to be highlighted. And Ms. Wong, can you bring any kind of a spotlight to bear on this challenge?
Thank you for the question. I do think this is a huge problem. I mean, you mentioned Airbnb, and there are many other companies. I think one big company is Apple. I mean, China is the Apple's second largest, market, and lots of people in China using the use iPhones. And by Chinese law, the Apple's data are stored in China. So basically, what you communicated through your iPhone inside China is known to the Chinese government. The database is jointly owned by Apple, and the Chinese government control the company. And besides that, over the years, Apple has taken down over 1,000 VPNs from the App Store. I mean, activists are extremely frustrated. They always tell me, I cannot find a VPN in the App Store to communicate, to access information blocked by China. And I brought that message to the company Apple. I mean, they always tell me the same message. We have to comply with the local law. Then I would tell them, but you have human rights commitment that is in your policy. How do you fulfill that human rights commitment? So there's always this back and forth. And it really, I don't know what's the solution. If Apple values its market in China so much, I really want to see, there should be more awareness of Apple's their complicity in human rights violations in China, because Apple has a good reputation here for its support for privacy rights. I think the public needs to be more aware of those tech companies, the behavior outside of the United States.
Thank you. Does any of our other witnesses wish to comment on this challenge?
If I could, I would just add that I think U.S. companies are not only facing that pressure within China, but increasingly in some third markets too, where they're being asked by foreign governments to provide access to their data. And that pressure is increased in situations where they have a Chinese competitor who's also operating in that market and does not hesitate to provide access to that data. And so I think it is not an easy challenge to solve when your competitor is willing to, sort of engage in that race to the bottom. The U.S. does have, trade tools it could use. I think we also need to, again, be working with partners and allies so that companies that are operating in our markets, in the United States and the European Union in particular, are abiding by that higher set of standards.
Thank you very, very much. And I thank all of our witnesses, Mr. Kane, Dr. Hoffman, Ms. Wong, Mr. Hillman, for sharing your expertise with us today and helping us to gain a better understanding of how to combat techno-authoritarianism. Your testimony has portrayed a truly chilling description of techno-authoritarianism and the surveillance state, a combination of old strategies of neighbors spying on neighbors and sanctions for misbehavior combined with new technological strategies that involve the collection of information from video monitors, from internet use, cell phone use, AI, artificial intelligence, processing of information to target specific individuals. Basically, an all-encompassing surveillance cage that turns humans into state-monitored and controlled robots stripped of their freedom of movement, their freedom of expression, as well as their cultural heritage. Second, that this strategy is spreading throughout the world through China's Belt and Road Initiative, including their Safe Cities program, their cybersecurity program, and through the interest of authoritarian governments in having more control over both targeted groups within their country and over their general population. Third, that the speed of technological development and deployment is outpacing the response of democratic governments to monitor it, to understand it, to respond to it, to set standards for it. Fourth, that without a lot of effort, scrutiny, and action, U.S. capital and technology become complicit in supporting and accelerating this techno-authoritarianism. Fifth, that China is using this strategy to also collect information on individuals throughout the world, including the Chinese diaspora, and that information is used to influence and control people outside of its borders. And sixth, that responding to Chinese techno-authoritarianism is going to require a coalition of free states and the development of an alternative model of technology that is equipment and practices, and that is certainly urgent for us to act. And I hope today's hearing has helped draw attention to this urgency and to the importance of the United States and other free nations to engage in international organizations that set international norms and standards, such as the International Communications Union, that we have to be very aware of and respond to the challenge of protecting data, that we need to recognize the need to increase our Chinese skills, including our Chinese language journalism, and that we need to help provide open source responses to applications, Chinese applications like Wechat. So that's a significant, challenging, and exceedingly important agenda, and I appreciate all of you for shedding a light on it today. We must pay attention and we must act. The record will remain open until the close of business on Friday, November 19th, for any members who would like to submit any information for the record or additional questions for our witnesses. Thank you all so much. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.